The world fell silent with the passing of Pope Francis. At 88 years old, the beloved pontiff had become more than the head of the Catholic Church. He had become a moral compass in a world increasingly defined by division, inequality, and unrest. His death, brought on by complications from severe pneumonia, came just days after what many now see as his final farewell. His surprise appearance at the Easter Sunday procession, where he offered a quiet but powerful blessing to over 35,000 faithful in St. Peter's Square. The sight of him, frail but still smiling, seemed to reassure many that he was recovering. Few could have imagined it would be his last public act. In his final week, Pope Francis met with global leaders, including U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, who was visiting the Vatican on a diplomatic trip through Asia. Behind closed doors, the Pope spoke of peace, of bridging divides, and of protecting the vulnerable, messages he had carried throughout his papacy. As news of his passing spread, church bells tolled across continents, from the bustling cities of South America to the silent chapels of Europe. From African villages to skyscrapers in New York, people of all faiths paused to reflect on the life of a man who reshaped the world's largest Christian denomination. Pope Francis was not just a pope, he was a phenomenon. His leadership style broke from centuries of tradition. His voice often spoke louder on issues of justice, mercy, and equality than on institutional authority. In an age where trust in institutions was fading, Pope Francis stood out not because of the power he held, but because of the way he used it, with humility, empathy, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Long before he became Pope Francis, Jorge Mario Bergoglio walked the working-class streets of Buenos Aires, a city of tango, Catholic tradition, and deep inequality. Born on December 17, 1936, in the neighborhood of Flores, he was the eldest of 5 children in a devout Italian immigrant family. His father, Mario, worked as a railway accountant. His mother, Regina, stayed at home to raise the children and instill in them the values of discipline, faith, and humility. The Bergoglio household was modest, filled with love and sacrifice, a far cry from the opulence often associated with the clergy he would one day lead. As a child, Jorge was known to be quiet, thoughtful, and deeply spiritual. He developed a strong sense of duty and empathy early on. One of the most formative moments of his youth came during a serious illness. At the age of 21, he was hospitalized with a severe lung infection, leading to the removal of part of one lung. The experience left him physically weaker, but spiritually stronger. He later described it as a moment of profound transformation, a confrontation with mortality that deepened his understanding of human vulnerability and suffering. In 1958, driven by a quiet yet burning desire to serve, he joined the Society of Jesus, commonly known as the Jesuits. This decision was both radical and deeply personal. The Jesuits were known not only for their intellectual discipline, but also for their strong emphasis on social justice and serving the marginalized. For Bergoglio, it was the perfect alignment of his faith and his convictions. He studied theology and philosophy with rigor, spending years immersed in contemplation and study. But unlike many who retreated into academic life, Bergoglio believed faith had to be lived out in the streets, among the poor, the forgotten, the struggling. He became a teacher, then a spiritual director, and eventually rector of the philosophical and theological faculty of San Miguel. His students recalled him as a stern but compassionate man, intensely focused but never detached. He cooked his own meals, washed his own clothes, and never sought attention. Even then, simplicity was his lifestyle, not a public performance. By 1992, he was appointed Auxiliary Bishop of Buenos Aires. In 1998, he became the Archbishop, a position of immense influence in a country deeply intertwined with Catholicism. But Bergoglio was no traditional archbishop. While many of his peers lived in palaces, he chose a simple apartment. While others drove in black sedans, he rode the city buses. Every morning, he would walk through the poorest slums of Buenos Aires, ministering to the homeless, visiting addicts, comforting single mothers, and praying with the sick. The people began calling him El Papa de los Pobres, the father of the poor. He never saw the church as a fortress to defend, but as a field hospital meant to heal the wounded. His sermons were fiery, but not self-righteous. He spoke against greed, corruption, and indifference. And in the political chaos that engulfed Argentina in the early 2000s, he urged the government to protect its citizens from hunger, unemployment, and despair. By the time the world's attention turned to Rome in 2013, Jorge Mario Bergoglio had already lived a lifetime of service. What many outside the Vatican didn't realize was that this quiet man from South America was about to change the papacy forever. March 13, 2013. The world was watching as smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel chimney in Vatican City. White smoke, a signal that a new pope had been chosen. But few could have guessed what would happen next. When the name Jorge Mario Bergoglio was announced, there was silence, confusion. Even many Catholics had never heard of the Argentine cardinal. Yet, in the heart of St. Peter's Square, a moment of quiet awe settled over the crowd. And then came the name he chose, Francis. No pope in history had ever taken that name before. It was a message, a symbol, a statement. By invoking the name of St. Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of the poor, the humble, and the environment, Bergoglio immediately signaled that his papacy would be something different. Not about power, not about wealth, but about simplicity, mercy, and compassion. From the very beginning, he broke traditions that had defined the papacy for centuries. Instead of standing above the crowd to bless them, he bowed and asked the people to pray for him. Instead of riding in the bulletproof Pope mobile, he chose a simple Fiat or even a small Ford. And instead of moving into the lavish papal apartments, he chose to live in a modest guest house, eating in the communal dining hall and walking the halls like any ordinary priest. His first actions were bold. He washed the feet of prisoners, including Muslims and women, during Holy Week. He visited refugee camps. He publicly embraced a man with a disfigured face, drawing the world's attention to those whom society often hides. But behind this humility was a fierce conviction. He launched a scathing critique of economic inequality, calling capitalism without conscience the dung of the devil. He warned of a globalization of indifference that numbed people to the suffering around them. And within the church, he began shaking the foundations. He opened doors for conversation around divorced Catholics, LGBTQ issues, and the role of women. While he never changed doctrine overnight, he changed the tone. And for many, that was revolutionary. Inside the Vatican, not everyone welcomed this. Some viewed him as too liberal, too political, too unpredictable. Conservative factions resisted him, and whispers of betrayal, leaks, and even sabotage began surfacing. But Pope Francis, the outsider, was not intimidated. He continued meeting with the poor instead of kings. He took selfies with young people instead of commanding silence. And above all, he reminded the world that the Church's mission wasn't to judge, but to heal. In just a few months, Jorge Bergoglio had transformed from an unknown cardinal to a global symbol of hope. He didn't seek power, but his authenticity gave him influence, He didn't demand change, but his example made it inevitable. But the challenges were just beginning. When Pope Francis stepped into the shoes of St. Peter, he also stepped into a storm. For years, the Vatican had been plagued by scandal, not just in the media, but within its very walls. Whispers of corruption, financial secrecy, and abuse had tarnished the image of the Church. The Vatican Bank, formerly known as the Institute for the Works of Religion, was at the center of controversy. Accused of money laundering, shady investments, and lack of oversight, it had become a symbol of how far the Church's leadership had drifted from its moral foundation. Francis wasted no time. He launched a full-scale financial overhaul. He created new departments focused on transparency, hired outside auditors, and formed a council of international experts to bring modern accountability to the Vatican's ancient institutions. Some cardinals were stripped of their influence. Long-protected financial managers were removed. The message was clear. No one, not even at the top, was untouchable. But this effort to cleanse the temple, as some described it, made him enemies. Inside the Curia, the Vatican's central governing body, resistance grew. Leaks were orchestrated to undermine his reforms. Conservative Catholic media outlets began publishing editorials questioning his legitimacy. Anonymous letters, books by disgruntled insiders, and coordinated campaigns tried to discredit his leadership. Still, Francis pressed forward. But the financial corruption was only part of a much deeper wound, one that had shattered faith in the Church across the globe: the sexual abuse crisis. Decades of cover-ups had caused unspeakable pain. Survivors had been ignored, silenced, or re-traumatized by the very people who were supposed to protect them. When Francis became pope, expectations were sky-high. He responded with sorrow, with anger, and eventually with action. He removed powerful bishops and cardinals who had enabled or participated in abuse. He defrocked former U.S. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, the highest-ranking church official ever to be laicized. He convened global summits on abuse, forcing bishops from every continent to confront the sins within their ranks. And in 2019, he passed new laws requiring every diocese to report abuse cases and hold bishops accountable. But even these steps weren't enough for some. Critics said he moved too slowly, that he didn't always act decisively when reports surfaced, that he remained bound by the Church's secretive traditions. Supporters, however, pointed out that no pope had ever gone further in facing the issue. He didn't just apologize. He confronted the Church's darkest truths and forced them into the light. And throughout it all, he never retreated into silence. He kept showing up. In prisons, in war zones, in slums, he kept washing feet. He kept listening. To the world, Pope Francis was becoming a symbol of both human imperfection and spiritual courage. A flawed leader fighting to rebuild trust in an institution that had betrayed so many. He was not just trying to lead a church, he was trying to redeem it. Pope Francis didn't stay behind Vatican walls. He believed the Church shouldn't be confined to rituals or Rome. Instead, he became a pilgrim, a pope on the move, determined to meet humanity where it lived and suffered. In the first months of his papacy, he traveled to Lampedusa, a small Italian island where thousands of African migrants had drowned trying to reach Europe. It was a powerful, symbolic act. There were no government officials, no pomp, just a simple altar made from shipwrecked wood and a sermon that shook consciences. He spoke of a globalization of indifference, where lives were lost and no one cared. From there, he went further. In 2015, he visited the Central African Republic. a war-torn nation ravaged by sectarian violence. Wearing a bulletproof vest beneath his white cassock, he opened the holy door of Bangui Cathedral, turning the world's attention to peace in a place forgotten by most of the world. The gesture was bold. No pope had ever gone to a conflict zone to open a Jubilee year. He traveled to Myanmar, where the Rohingya were facing ethnic cleansing. Though his diplomatic language was cautious, he later met with Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh and said clearly, "The presence of God today is also called Rohingya." He went to Iraq in 2021, the first pope in history to do so. Despite pandemic fears and security risks, Francis walked the ruins of Mosul, prayed in churches destroyed by ISIS, and met with Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, one of Shia Islam's most revered leaders. The moment was historic. Catholic and Muslim clerics, side by side, discussing peace and coexistence in a land drenched in blood. And still, his travels weren't just about diplomacy. They were about showing up. In South America, he defended the rights of indigenous communities. In the Philippines, he comforted survivors of Typhoon Haiyan. In Canada, he issued a long-awaited apology to indigenous peoples for the Church's role in the residential school system, calling it a devastating error and begging for forgiveness. Wherever he went, he carried one consistent message: peace is possible. But peace, he said, isn't silence. It's justice, it's truth, it's dignity. Whether speaking to the U.S. Congress or a remote village, Francis repeated the same refrain: listen to the poor, care for the planet, reject war, and remember the forgotten. And he didn't just preach it, he embodied it. A pilgrim with a limp, slowed by age, but driven by a moral fire. He refused to rest while the world burned. He believed the church had to go to the margins, to the edges of suffering, to the outskirts of faith, and sometimes even into enemy territory. He wasn't just a pope. He was a bridge builder, one step at a time. Pope Francis may have worn white robes, but inside the Vatican, the battles he fought were anything but pure. His biggest enemies weren't atheists, world leaders, or even secular culture. They were men in collars and red hats, cardinals, bishops, power brokers. From the moment he stepped onto the balcony in 2013, Francis threatened a system that had protected itself for centuries. He began cutting the perks. Bishops were told to live simply, to drive modest cars, and to stop acting like princes. Vatican offices, known for luxury and political games, were put under scrutiny. He launched a cleanup of the Vatican Bank, long plagued by corruption, secrecy, and scandal. Suddenly, untouchable men were under investigation. This wasn't reform. This was war. Inside the Curia, whispers turned into open defiance. Some said he was destroying tradition. Others accused him of being too political, too lenient, too modern. Conservative cardinals wrote public letters demanding he answer yes or no questions on Catholic doctrine. They wanted clarity, but what they really wanted was control. One of his fiercest opponents was Cardinal Raymond Burke, an American who became a figurehead for ultra-traditionalist resistance. He warned that Francis was sowing confusion in the church. He wasn't alone. Entire movements grew online, accusing the Pope of heresy, of abandoning the faith, even of being the Antichrist. It was brutal. When Francis said, "Divorced and remarried, Catholics should be welcomed, not condemned," critics screamed betrayal. When he allowed women into liturgical roles or spoke about blessing same-sex couples, they claimed he was dismantling the church piece by piece. But Francis didn't flinch. He said, "Reality is more important than ideas." He wanted a church that responded to pain, not one obsessed with rules. He believed mercy mattered more than dogma. Still, the backlash was constant. Books, blogs, TV shows, all attacking him. Some said he was a Marxist. Others said he was too soft on China, or Islam, or communism. They said he was dividing the church. Francis calmly kept moving forward. Behind the scenes, the resistance sometimes turned personal. Leaks, sabotage, even alleged spying on his inner circle. His reform of church finances made enemies. His emphasis on transparency made others nervous. And when he tackled sexual abuse, he found the church's darkest secrets protected by some of its most powerful men. Francis wasn't naive. He knew the system he was confronting, but he also knew the price of silence. He once told a group of priests, "Speak clearly. And if someone gets mad, well, so be it." He was the Pope who smiled in public and fought like a lion in private. The Vatican, under Francis, was a battlefield. And the war wasn't just over theology. It was over the soul of the Church. While Pope Francis's public life was defined by bold reforms, passion, and unwavering commitment to the Church, behind the scenes, his health began to decline in ways few had anticipated. The humble Pope, always focused on his mission, was also battling the inevitable realities of aging. It started quietly. He began to slow down. His trademark energy, the physical vigor that had driven him to travel relentlessly and confront world leaders, started to show signs of wear. His knees, particularly, became a source of concern. In 2020, after a series of public appearances, Francis confirmed that he was struggling with sciatica, a condition that caused him chronic pain and difficulty walking. But the Pope didn't let that stop him. Even as his body grew weaker, his spirit remained indomitable. He began to rely more on a wheelchair, but his work never ceased. He attended meetings, delivered speeches, and met with world leaders, all while adapting to his new limitations. Pope Francis became a symbol of resilience, showing that true leadership isn't about strength or agility. It's about the ability to endure and keep serving, even when the body betrays you. But even more challenging than his sciatica were the health scares that followed. In 2021, Pope Francis underwent surgery for diverticular stenosis, a condition affecting his colon. Though the procedure was deemed successful, it was a reminder that time was not on his side. The recovery was slow, and rumors about his health began to circulate. Yet, the Pope kept a calm, composed exterior. He told the public not to worry, assuring them that his health was under control and that he was focusing on getting better. In the years that followed, there were more whispers of illnesses, more signs that his age and health were catching up to him. Despite his health struggles, Pope Francis never allowed his personal situation to overshadow his papacy. His unwavering commitment to his work remained steadfast. However, with the passing of time, it became clear that even the greatest leaders must face the frailty of the human condition. His public appearances became less frequent. When he did appear, there was a noticeable weariness to his demeanor, a reminder that even a pope is not immune to the inevitable march of time. In 2023, during the Christmas season, Pope Francis made one of his final appearances at the Vatican. He was noticeably frail, his hands trembling slightly as he greeted the faithful. Despite his clear physical challenges, there was a sense of peace in his eyes. He had lived a life dedicated to others, and he knew that his legacy would live on long after his final days. By the spring of 2024, it became clear that Pope Francis was no longer the man who had once traveled tirelessly around the world, shaking hands, offering blessings, and advocating for peace. He had given everything to the Church, but now the Church was preparing to say goodbye to its beloved leader. His final days were marked by his struggle with severe pneumonia, a battle that even his indomitable spirit could not overcome. His health had deteriorated rapidly, leaving millions who had once been touched by his compassion, strength, and vision, praying for his recovery. Yet, in his final moments, Pope Francis remained a man of peace, a man of the people, and a man of faith. Though frail in body, he remained strong in faith until the very end. He continued to preach love, compassion, and unity, even as his body weakened. His death, on April 20th, 2024, was a shock to the world. But his passing was also a testament to his life, a life of service, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to the gospel. As the Church mourned the loss of its leader, many found solace in the knowledge that Pope Francis had left behind a legacy of love and humility, of a church more inclusive, more compassionate, and more focused on social justice. He had been a pope who had faced not just external challenges, but internal struggles with health, age, and the pressures of an institution that often resisted change. Pope Francis's life was a testament to the power of faith to endure through adversity. Even in his final days, he remained a beacon of hope for millions, a reminder that true leadership is not about personal strength, but about the ability to serve others, no matter the cost. When Pope Francis passed away on April 20th, 2024, the world was united in mourning. For over a decade, he had been a spiritual leader to more than 1 billion Catholics and a guiding force in global discussions on peace, social justice, and climate change. His death was not just a loss for the Catholic Church. It was a loss for humanity at large. From the Vatican to the farthest corners of the globe, tributes poured in from all sectors of society. Religious leaders from different faiths, political figures, celebrities, and everyday people shared their memories and expressed their gratitude for the transformative impact Pope Francis had on the world. In the Vatican, the loss was deeply felt. Cardinals, priests, and bishops who had worked alongside him for years expressed their sorrow and admiration for his leadership. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican's Secretary of State, gave an emotional eulogy, speaking of Pope Francis's deep faith, commitment to peace, and tireless efforts to bring about a more compassionate and inclusive church. Many praised the Pope's focus on the poor, the marginalized, and the downtrodden. He had always been a voice for those who had none. Whether it was speaking out against the abuse of migrants or advocating for the rights of indigenous peoples, Pope Francis made it clear that the Church's mission extended far beyond its walls. His deep commitment to justice and the dignity of every human being resonated not only within Catholic circles, but also among leaders and activists of other faiths and ideologies. The global political reaction was also immediate. U.S. President Joe Biden, a devout Catholic, paid tribute to Pope Francis in a moving statement. He spoke of the Pope's unwavering commitment to justice, his tireless advocacy for the environment, and his efforts to unite people of different faiths and backgrounds. Similarly, world leaders from all corners of the globe sent their condolences, including the presidents of France, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, the Pope's homeland. In Argentina, the nation where Jorge Mario Bergoglio was born, there was a collective sense of loss, as well as deep pride. Pope Francis was the first Latin American pope in history, and his connection to his native Argentina was always strong. The country declared a national period of mourning, with public memorial services held in his honor. Argentine citizens took to the streets, holding vigils and praying for their former archbishop, who had ascended to the highest office in the Catholic Church. Pope Francis's death also resonated deeply with the Catholic community across the globe. From the Philippines to Poland, from the United States to the remotest villages in Africa, Catholics remembered a pope who had touched their lives in deeply personal ways. For many, Pope Francis had been more than just a spiritual leader. He had been a guiding light in an often turbulent world. His humility, his focus on the poor, and his call for social justice had made him a pope for the people, transcending the traditional boundaries of the papacy. His death left a void that would be hard to fill. For the Catholic faithful, the question of who would succeed Pope Francis became a central concern. In the days following his death, attention turned to the process of selecting a new pope. The papal conclave, a centuries-old tradition, would soon be convened, and it was clear that the next pope would inherit a church shaped by the reforms of Pope Francis, but also facing new challenges in a rapidly changing world. The College of Cardinals, responsible for electing the next pope, found itself at a crossroads. Pope Francis had worked tirelessly to diversify the college, elevating cardinals from Africa, Asia, and Latin America to positions of power within the Church. His push for a more global, inclusive Church had reshaped the Vatican's leadership, and many hoped that this diversification would continue in the election of his successor. Some speculated that the next pope could come from the global south, potentially from Africa or Asia, regions where the Catholic Church was experiencing unprecedented growth. A pope from these regions would be seen as a continuation of Pope Francis's vision for a more inclusive and globally minded church. However, there were also those who believed that the next pope would likely come from Europe, given the historical significance of the region to the Church. Europe remains home to the majority of the world's Catholic population, and many of the Church's most senior cardinals are still European. Yet it was clear that the election of the next pope would be influenced by the legacy of Pope Francis and his emphasis on a more inclusive, global church. The papal conclave, set to take place in the weeks following Pope Francis's death, would be a momentous event. As cardinals gather to cast their votes in the Sistine Chapel, the world watches in anticipation. It was not just a question of who would be elected, but what direction the Church would take in the wake of Pope Francis's reforms. Would his legacy be preserved, or would the next pope seek to return to more traditional practices? Pope Francis had made it clear throughout his papacy that the Church must adapt to the needs of the modern world. He had emphasized the importance of pastoral care, of reaching out to those on the margins, and of embracing change while maintaining a deep commitment to the core principles of the faith. The new pope would need to carry forward these ideals, navigating the tensions between tradition and modernity, between orthodox and reform. As the conclave approached, discussions about the future of the Catholic Church began to dominate headlines. Scholars, theologians, and church leaders debated what direction the next pope should take. Should they continue Pope Francis's work on social justice, environmentalism, and inclusivity? Or would they focus more on doctrinal purity and preserving the Church's traditional teachings? The answers to these questions would shape the future of the Catholic Church for years to come. In the days following Pope Francis's death, the Vatican began preparations for his funeral, a grand yet humble affair. It would be a final opportunity for the world to pay its respects to a pope who had spent his life serving others. The funeral, set to take place at St. Peter's Basilica, would be attended by world leaders, religious figures, and countless faithful from around the world. It would be a moment to honor a pope whose leadership had changed the course of history. Pope Francis's legacy, however, would not be defined by his funeral or the events that followed his death. His true legacy was in the hearts and minds of the millions he had touched during his life. His message of love, inclusivity, and social justice would continue to inspire future generations of Catholics and people of all faiths. His efforts to bridge divides, heal wounds, and promote peace would leave an indelible mark on the world. As the Catholic Church entered a new chapter with the election of a new pope, one thing was certain: the legacy of Pope Francis would live on, shaping the future of the Church and the world for years to come. As the world continues to mourn the loss of Pope Francis, the question remains: what lies ahead for the Catholic Church? The election of a new pope marks the beginning of a new chapter, but it also presents significant challenges and opportunities. Pope Francis's reforms, particularly his emphasis on social justice, environmental sustainability, and the Church's outreach to marginalized communities, will cast a long shadow. The future of the Church, in many ways, will be shaped by how his successor navigates the complexities of a rapidly changing world. The new pope will inherit a church that has undergone profound changes during Pope Francis's papacy. The reforms he championed, such as the synodal process and his efforts to address the sexual abuse crisis, have already had a lasting impact on the Church's structure and culture. The challenge for the next pope will be to preserve these reforms while addressing the ongoing struggles within the Church, including issues of transparency, inclusivity, and global relevance. One of the key challenges facing the next pope will be how to continue Pope Francis's efforts to engage with the broader world. The Church, under Pope Francis, had made significant strides in building relationships with other faiths, political leaders, and social movements. His commitment to interfaith dialogue and collaboration was a hallmark of his papacy. However, the global landscape is ever-changing, and the new pope will need to find innovative ways to continue these efforts while responding to the evolving needs of the faithful. The Church's relationship with the modern world has always been a delicate balancing act. Pope Francis was known for his open approach to contemporary issues, from climate change to economic inequality, and his willingness to challenge both political and religious leaders on matters of justice. The next pope will need to strike a similar balance, remaining faithful to the Church's traditions while addressing the concerns of the 21st century. Another significant challenge for the next pope will be maintaining the unity of the Church. Throughout Pope Francis's papacy, there were those within the Church who criticized his reforms, particularly his more progressive stance on issues such as the role of women in the Church and LGBTQ+ rights. These tensions, while never fully resolved, were kept in check by the Pope's leadership and pastoral approach. The new Pope will need to navigate these divisions carefully, ensuring that the Church remains united in its mission and vision. The future of the Church's role in global social justice movements will also be a critical issue. Pope Francis's outspoken advocacy for the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized has redefined the Church's social teachings. He often spoke out against economic systems that he believed perpetuated inequality and injustice. His successor will need to continue this work, especially as issues such as poverty, inequality, and climate change become even more pressing in the coming years. The rise of global nationalism and populism, particularly in Europe and the Americas, presents another challenge for the Church. Pope Francis was an ardent advocate for refugees, migrants, and global solidarity. However, the growing political climate of fear and isolationism in many countries has created a more hostile environment for these initiatives. The new pope will have to decide how to engage with these political shifts, all while maintaining the Church's commitment to compassion and solidarity. One area where the new pope could potentially continue Pope Francis's work is in the realm of ecological justice. Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si called for urgent action on climate change and environmental degradation. As the effects of climate change become more apparent and urgent, the Church's role in advocating for the environment will continue to be crucial. The next pope will need to carry forward this call for ecological justice, both within the Church and in the broader political and social spheres. Despite these challenges, there are also significant opportunities for the Church to continue its positive impact on the world. Pope Francis's papacy was marked by a focus on inclusivity, dialogue, and social justice. The next pope has the opportunity to continue these efforts, building on the foundation that Pope Francis laid. The next pope could also continue to strengthen the Church's outreach to young people, who have often felt disconnected from the institution. Pope Francis's focus on youth engagement and his efforts to make the Church more accessible to younger generations were central aspects of his papacy. The next pope will need to continue to speak to the concerns of young people, particularly in an era of digital connectivity, social media, and rapid technological change. One area of focus could be further embracing the role of women within the Church. While Pope Francis took significant steps toward promoting women in leadership roles within the Vatican, there is still much work to be done. The next pope could build upon this progress by continuing to explore ways in which the Church can empower women and provide greater opportunities for their participation in decision-making processes. The legacy of Pope Francis will undoubtedly be a guiding force for the next pope. His efforts to make the Church more inclusive, compassionate, and focused on justice have left an indelible mark. However, the next pope will need to make his own mark on the Church.